Welcome, dear subscribers and curious listeners of my channel. The world of Harry Potter is not just full of magic and adventure, it's bursting with unforgettable villains, each leaving their mark in their own twisted way. But even the darkest of dark wizards weren't immune to missteps. Today, we're diving into the most ridiculous, baffling, and downright foolish blunders made by the forces of evil. Sit back, enjoy the show, and let the breakdown of villainous blunders begin. Number 1. Voldemort. When drama beats victory. He's the embodiment of terror, fear, and magical might. But even Lord Voldemort had his flaws, his biggest mistake, valuing theatrics over efficiency. During his resurrection in the Goblet of Fire, he stages an entire performance. Long speeches, a dramatic duel, monologues galore, instead of just killing Harry and eliminating the threat. In Order of the Phoenix, he had another chance. Harry was vulnerable and disoriented, but again, Voldemort stalls. And in the Battle of Hogwarts, he chooses to wait and bargain instead of striking while his Horcruxes were still intact. Why? To be dramatic. That hesitation cost him everything. Number 2, Bellatrix Lestrange, love for the Dark Lord. The most deranged follower of Voldemort suddenly falls in love? The cursed child implies that Bellatrix had a child with Voldemort, and honestly, it raises more questions than it answers. First, Bellatrix was married. Second, her fanatical obsession with blood purity should have made her reject Voldemort, who was a half-blood. And why would Voldemort, who disdains love and humanity, father a child? It's not romantic. It's just weird. Number 3, Lucius Malfoy giving Ginny the diary. Lucius is a clever, calculating man, but in Chamber of Secrets he makes a truly baffling move, handing off a powerful, magical object, Tom Riddle's diary, to a Hogwarts student. Ginny Weasley, despite her blood status, was just a kid. Risking such a dangerous artifact for the sake of political games at school? That's reckless at best, idiotic at worst. It exposed Lucius to suspicion, endangered his standing, and nearly blew Voldemort's return. Number 4, Dolores Umbridge firing Trelawney. In Order of the Phoenix, Umbridge hated anyone who didn't fit her rigid worldview. But firing Professor Trelawney, was that smart? She could have discredited Trelawney quietly or used her as a pawn. But no, she made it a public humiliation. That backfired spectacularly. Teachers, students, and even Dumbledore turned against her. One act of cruelty cost her what little credibility she had. Number 5, Gilderoy Lockhart, cracking under pressure. At first glance, he's a joke, but in reality, Lockhart was a dangerous fraud. For years, he stole others' stories and wiped their memories. But in Chamber of Secrets, he makes a critical error. He confesses everything to Harry and Ron. Instead of spinning another lie or just fleeing, he walks right into disaster. His attempt to erase their memories backfires, leaving him with no identity at all. The master deceiver, undone by his own spell. Number 6, Peter Pettigrew, hiding with the Weasleys. Pettigrew wasn't a mastermind, but he was sly and cowardly. His frame job on Sirius worked perfectly. But after escaping, why did he hide with a family so deeply connected to the Order? As a rat, he lived with Ron Weasley for years. In a household that included Arthur, ministry employee, Bill, Gringotts, and Charlie, dragon expert. Then he even returned to Hogwarts, all while knowing the Marauders map existed and his old friends were alive. That's not cunning, it's madness. Number 7, Quirrell, trying to kill Harry at a Quidditch match. And finally, Professor Quirrell. Mild-mannered, stuttering, secretly possessed by Voldemort. But why, oh why did he try to kill Harry during a Quidditch match? Hundreds of witnesses, professors, students, Dumbledore himself, and Quirrell decides to knock Harry off his broom. With magic, if not for Hermione and Snape, the entire plot would have been exposed. That wasn't strategy, that was stupidity, pure and simple. Number 8. Barty Crouch Jr. playing games with the Goblet of Fire. Barty Crouch Jr. had everything he needed. Polyjuice Potion, Mad-Eye Moody's Wand, Dumbledore's Trust. For nearly a year, he walked the halls of Hogwarts as a professor. No one suspected him, not McGonagall, not Snape, not even Harry. He could have stunned the boy in a corridor, vanished him in plain sight, but instead he turned the Triwizard Tournament into a trap. "You have been taught," he whispered to Harry after the third task. But it wasn't teaching, it was theatre. Dangerous, unnecessary theatre. Each task was another chance to be caught. The dragons, the lake, the maze. Too many eyes, too many variables. And for what? So Voldemort could resurrect himself in a graveyard ceremony while the entire wizarding world watched a student disappear from under their noses? It worked. Barely. But when Harry returned with Cedric's body and the truth, everything unravelled. Moody was exposed. The Ministry panicked. Voldemort's return was revealed far too soon, all because Barty chose spectacle over simplicity. Number 9. Fenrir Greyback attacking Bill Weasley. Fenrir Greyback didn't fight for ideology. He fought for blood. During the Battle of the Astronomy Tower in The Half-Blood Prince, he lunged at Bill Weasley without warning, not because Bill was a threat, not because it was strategic, just because he could. He savaged him. It was brutal, Remus Lupin told the others afterward. There was no full moon, no transformation, just hunger and hate. The attack served no purpose for Voldemort's side. Bill wasn't a commanding officer. He wasn't casting spells that changed the tide of battle, but he was a Weasley. And that was enough for Fenrir. What Greyback didn't consider was what that act would ignite. The Weasleys, already fighting, became unbreakable. Fleur Delacour, far from walking away, stood taller. "I am good-looking enough for both of us, I think," she said, her voice defiant, her love unshaken. By injuring Bill, Greyback didn't weaken the Order, he strengthened it. Molly fought harder, Ron fought with fire in his chest, even Percy came back to the family. It was a mistake driven by cruelty, not calculation, and in war, cruelty without strategy turns into fuel for the other side. Fenrir wanted fear. What he created was unity. Number 10, Draco Malfoy, refusing to identify Harry. Draco Malfoy stood in Malfoy Manor, staring at the swollen, bruised face of the boy brought in by snatchers. "Is it him, Draco? Is it Harry Potter?" Lucius leaned in, desperate. Narcissa waited in silence, but Draco didn't speak. He hesitated. "I can't be sure," he muttered. And just like that, he let the moment slip. It wasn't confusion, it was choice, because Draco knew exactly who stood before him. The boy he had mocked for years, the boy he had envied, the boy he had once wanted to destroy. It was a dangerous refusal. Voldemort was watching everything now, every action, every hesitation. If Lucius had pressed harder, if Bellatrix had sensed deceit, Draco might have died that night alongside Dobby, but something inside him had shifted. He had watched people tortured, he had been forced to disarm Dumbledore, and now, standing in front of his enemies, he chose not to betray them, not because he forgave them, but because he couldn't bring himself to go any further. This moment marked the end of the mask. Draco was no longer the boy who bragged in Slytherin corridors. He was a young man caught in something far beyond schoolyard rivalry. "Draco, is he in this room?" Voldemort would ask later. And again Draco would hesitate. He had once dreamed of proving himself, but when the cost became human, real, he stepped back. And that, for a Death Eater's son, was a betrayal more dangerous than any open rebellion. Number 11, Cornelius Fudge, ignoring Voldemort's return. Cornelius Fudge saw the truth in Dumbledore's eyes and chose to turn away. After the third task in the Goblet of Fire, Harry returned, with Cedric's dead body and the words, "He's back, Voldemort's back." But instead of believing the boy who had faced death and survived it, Fudge accused him of lying. "He's confused," Fudge insisted. "He's been through a lot." But the truth was plain. Cedric was dead, and no school competition could explain that. In the months that followed, Fudge waged a quiet war, not against Voldemort, but against those who dared to speak the truth. He used the Daily Prophet to discredit Harry. He sent Umbridge to Hogwarts to silence Dumbledore. He cut ties with the only people capable of mounting real resistance. "You are blinded by the love of the office you hold, Cornelius," Dumbledore shouted in the Order of the Phoenix. But Fudge heard only threats, not warnings, not pleas. By the time the truth could no longer be hidden, when Voldemort appeared in the Ministry itself, it was too late. The Death Eaters had returned, they had regrouped, and the Ministry had lost a year that could have changed everything. Cornelius Fudge didn't need to cast a dark spell to help Voldemort. All he had to do was look the other way. Number 12. Severus Snape, excessive cruelty towards students. Severus Snape insulted Neville Longbottom so often it became routine. "Why are you still unable to brew a simple potion?" he barked as the class stared at Neville's trembling hands. But this wasn't discipline. It was humiliation. In The Prisoner of Azkaban, Neville's greatest fear, his boggart, didn't take the shape of Voldemort, a Death Eater, or even a spider. It turned into Snape, a teacher. That alone tells us everything we need to know. Snape's cruelty to Harry was more than just personal. "You are just like your father," he'd spit, dragging James's memory like a weapon. Yet Harry had never done anything to deserve such venom, other than exist. It made no sense for a man with such a vital secret role to draw constant attention to himself. Dumbledore trusted Snape to stay hidden in plain sight. But the way he pushed students, publicly, bitterly, put that trust at risk. If anyone had started asking why Snape hated Harry too much, they might have started pulling at threads. In The Half-Blood Prince, Snape mocks Hermione for being a know-it-all in front of the class. Even Ron looks uncomfortable. For someone whose every step required control and silence, Snape's temper was dangerous. The line between disguise and genuine cruelty blurred too often. Even Minerva McGonagall once snapped at him, saying, "That will do, Severus," after he went too far. It wasn't just an act. At times it looked like a man cracking under years of unresolved hatred. And that's the tragedy, because Snape was a hero, because he loved, because he gave everything. But the way he treated children, not just Harry, but students like Neville and Hermione, risked everything he worked for. It wasn't calculated, it was emotional. And for a spy working under the nose of the darkest wizard alive, emotion was the one thing he couldn't afford. Number 13, Voldemort, failing to protect his Horcruxes. Voldemort feared death more than anything. He split his soul into pieces to avoid it, a violation of nature itself. But the way he treated his Horcruxes told a different story. It was almost careless. He handed Tom Riddle's diary, a living piece of his soul, to Lucius Malfoy as if it were a propaganda leaflet. "Keep it safe," he might have said. But Lucius used it as a weapon, slipping it into Ginny Weasley's cauldron. A schoolgirl, a gamble, one that nearly backfired and exposed the entire plan. The ring of Marvolo Gaunt, another Horcrux, was left in the ruins of his grandfather's shack. Voldemort never even tried to enchant it properly. Dumbledore found it easily. Cursed, yes, but untouched. He took it in silence, examining the Deathly Hallows symbol carved into the stone. "You were the boy who searched for his family," Dumbledore once whispered. Voldemort hid pieces of himself in places that meant something to him, not in places that made them unreachable. The diadem of Rowena Ravenclaw was hidden in the Room of Requirement, a room that changed itself, yes, but was still a secret many students knew. Even Harry had used it before, to hide a potions book. That same book helped him brew Felix Felicis, which later led him straight to the memory of Slughorn. Irony folded into irony, Voldemort thought the room belonged to him alone. He never imagined that generations of students had found it, used it, and whispered about it in the halls. There was no fortress, no army guarding his soul, only arrogance. Voldemort believed no one would ever understand him. "I who have gone further than anybody along the path that leads to immortality," he once boasted. But immortality, when built on vanity and overconfidence, crumbles fast. Harry, Ron, and Hermione didn't need dark magic to find the Horcruxes, just knowledge, curiosity, and the proof that sometimes the greatest mistake of a Dark Lord is thinking no one else is smart enough to catch him. Number 14. Gellert Grindelwald, choosing to trust Credence. Gellert Grindelwald saw something in Credence Barebone that others didn't. Not just a weapon, but a prophecy, a force strong enough to challenge Albus Dumbledore himself. "He is the key to our victory," Grindelwald once said. But in that moment of conviction he ignored the obvious. Credence was not a soldier. He was a lost boy, orphaned, broken by the Salem Church, abused by Mary Lou Barebone, and feared for what he couldn't control. Entrusting him with a war was like handing a sword to a ghost. During the events in Fantastic Beasts: The Crimes of Grindelwald, Credence's mind teetered between desperation and rage. When he destroyed part of Paris with a single surge of obscurial energy, Grindelwald stood watching, convinced he had found his chosen one. But Credence's powers came from pain, not mastery. There's a moment when Queenie, watching the chaos unfold, whispers, "He doesn't know who he is." And that's the truth. How could someone fight Dumbledore, the most brilliant wizard of his age, without even knowing his own name? Grindelwald's mistake was not in recognizing power, but in misjudging its source. He cloaked Credence in mystery, fed him half-truths, and gave him a name, Aurelius Dumbledore. But even that, possibly a lie, only deepened the boy's confusion. Credence needed healing, guidance, not a place in a war. When he faced Dumbledore in The Secrets of Dumbledore, it wasn't vengeance in his eyes, it was hesitation, and Grindelwald, for all his cunning, never prepared him for that. Dumbledore, when finally standing before Credence, didn't raise his wand. He simply said, "You're not alone." In that line was everything Grindelwald failed to understand. Power without stability is chaos, and a confused boy with a bleeding heart was never the weapon Grindelwald imagined. Number 15, Voldemort killing Snape for the Elder Wand. It was not the killing curse that sealed Lord Voldemort's fate. It was his failure to understand loyalty, that most human of forces, and the will of an ancient wand born from blood and betrayal. In the bowels of the shrieking shack, as Nagini coiled and struck under her master's orders, a thread of history snapped, severing Voldemort from his last, silent protector. Severus Snape died not as the master of the Elder Wand, but as the Dark Lord's most misunderstood casualty. Voldemort's plan had failed before the snake sank her fangs. The moment he chose to act without clarity, he ensured his end. Voldemort had spent much of his return obsessed with artifacts of power. The Elder Wand became the pinnacle of that obsession, a wand carved by death itself, if legends were to be believed. Gregorovitch once sought it, Grindelwald wielded it, and Dumbledore, wise, cautious Dumbledore, kept it hidden. But Voldemort, blinded by conquest, believed the wand's allegiance could be bent by force, not won by right. He thought the wand would obey the victor, yet he never questioned what victory truly meant in the language of ancient magic. The murder of Severus Snape was not simply an act of cold strategy, it was a moment of blindness. Voldemort stood on the ruins of trust, believing that the wand refused him because it belonged to another. "The wand will not serve me properly, Severus," he said, moments before ordering Nagini to end the life of the only man who might have warned him. He miscalculated the very nature of wand law. The Elder Wand did not seek blood, it sought conquest, and conquest was not always won through death. Snape's life had been a long corridor of secrets, his loyalty veiled behind cruelty and silence. To Voldemort he was a tool, useful in the shadows, expendable when light was needed. But Snape had walked both sides of the war, and in his final moments he gave not allegiance, but memory. "Take them, take them," he whispered to Harry, offering not resistance, but revelation. Even in death he remained Dumbledore's, not Voldemort's, a truth the Dark Lord never considered. The Elder Wand's allegiance had passed from Dumbledore not to Snape, but to Draco Malfoy, a boy whose disarming spell, cast in fear rather than intent, had inadvertently shifted power. When Draco disarmed the headmaster atop the astronomy tower, he unknowingly became the wand's new master. Voldemort, who killed Snape to seize the wand's loyalty, never saw Draco as anything more than a weak pawn. In doing so, he dismissed the very chain of events that would doom him. Harry Potter, in turn, disarmed Draco at Malfoy Manor, not in a grand duel, but in a brief, desperate skirmish. That moment, brief and chaotic, carried more weight than any killing curse. As Harry wrested Draco's wand from his grip, the Elder Wand, aware of its true master, recognized the transfer. It was not spectacle that bound the wand, but the simple rules of magical ownership. Voldemort, with all his power, never saw it. He had killed Snape for nothing. Had Voldemort understood this, had he paused to reflect on the magic deeper than spells, he might have realized that wands, especially those as old as the Elder Wand, followed allegiance, not brute force. The wand had never been his, never truly. It fought against him not from rebellion, but from recognition. Voldemort was not its master. It did not hate him. It simply knew another name. This mistake was not born from ignorance, but from arrogance. Voldemort believed himself above the laws of magic. His Horcruxes had made him feel untouchable. Death was an inconvenience to be outwitted. The subtleties of wand law, of loyalty and bond, were beneath him. He had no concept of mercy or sacrifice, and thus no ability to comprehend a magic that thrived on it. Snape's death became a tragedy in two dimensions: the tragedy of a man who lived unloved and died alone, and the tragedy of a warlord whose mind could not grasp that love, not fear, shaped destiny. Snape had not claimed the wand's loyalty. He had not killed Dumbledore in conquest. He had done so on the headmaster's own orders, a mercy kill disguised as treachery. Voldemort, blind to that sacrifice, saw only a stepping stone to power. In The Prince's Tale, readers see the memories Snape gives to Harry, snapshots of a life shrouded in bitterness but driven by love. The boy who loved Lily Evans, the man who protected her son out of penance, never sought power for himself. In one of the most poignant passages of the series, Dumbledore asks, "After all this time?" and Snape replies, "Always." This one word, this final truth, revealed that Snape was never Voldemort's. The Elder Wand knew that. Voldemort, for all his genius, could not understand this. He dismissed the idea that a wand might choose based on intent rather than action. In the end, his greatest enemy was not Harry Potter, but his own inability to see magic as more than a weapon. He killed Snape as one might tear down a locked door, expecting the house behind it to yield. But the house had already moved. The Elder Wand, carved from elder wood with a core of thestral tail hair, was the most capricious of the Deathly Hallows. It demanded mastery through challenge, not inheritance. Grindelwald had stolen it from Gregorovitch. Dumbledore had defeated Grindelwald. Draco had disarmed Dumbledore. Harry had disarmed Draco. The path was clear, but Voldemort refused to see it. He sought dominion, not truth. This refusal cost him dearly. With Snape's death, he lost the only man who understood both sides of the war. Snape had served Dumbledore and Voldemort, but belonged to neither. He belonged to his cause, the protection of Lily's son. That cause was invisible to Voldemort, who believed devotion could be purchased with fear and oaths. He never understood that Snape's strength lay in what he chose not to reveal. Snape's murder, then, was a moment of irreversible loss, not just of a man, but of knowledge, Had Voldemort questioned Snape, truly questioned, he might have glimpsed the deeper truth. But Voldemort never questioned. He commanded, he assumed, he acted, and in doing so he eliminated the last person who could have shown him the danger ahead. He walked into his final battle with a wand that would never obey him. Number 16. Crabbe, using fiend fire in the Room of Requirement. It could have been a triumph, a moment carved into the history of dark ambition, with 3 Slytherin students finally outmaneuvering Harry Potter and his closest allies. In that instant, amid the crumbling walls of Hogwarts, Draco Malfoy, Vincent Crabbe, and Gregory Goyle had the upper hand. They had chased Harry, Ron, and Hermione into a sealed version of the Room of Requirement, one bursting with centuries of forgotten magic and dangerous relics. There were no professors to save them, no secret tunnels to escape through. Victory was tangible, and yet it was Crabbe who shattered the moment, not with cunning or strength, but with the blind and fatal invocation of fiend fire. Vincent Crabbe had never been known for his brilliance. He was muscle, bulk, and silence, Malfoy's ever-present shadow. But during the events of the Battle of Hogwarts, something shifted in him. Perhaps it was fear disguised as rage, or a need to assert control in a world unraveling. Perhaps, in a final act of desperation, he wanted to prove himself, not as the dumb follower, but as someone capable of unthinkable power. What he unleashed, however, was not control. It was chaos incarnate. Fiend fire, an ancient and cursed flame that consumes everything in its path, was not a spell to be taken lightly. It could devour Horcruxes, melt through magical protections, and rise in the shapes of monstrous beasts. Crabbe's father may have mentioned it once, perhaps during a drunken conversation about dark arts best left alone, but knowledge is not mastery, and in this case knowledge was fatal. The moment Crabbe spoke the incantation, the air thickened. The temperature surged. Flames erupted not in gentle tongues, but in furious columns that cracked stone and split metal. The enchanted room, which had served countless students as a haven, a storage chamber, a training ground, began to transform into a death trap. Hogwarts itself seemed to groan beneath the weight of what had been summoned. Harry saw it first, the fire's eerie intelligence. It was not ordinary flame. It was alive. A dragon of fire clawed its way across a bookshelf. A serpent of molten heat slithered beneath a collapsing table. The fire hunted, and Crabbe, who had sparked this inferno, could do nothing to stop it. He stood frozen, mouth agape, as the spell spiraled beyond his control. Crabbe must be on something, Ron muttered later, recounting the moment. But no substance or curse had driven him. Just hubris. It's important to remember the context. Crabbe, Malfoy, and Goyle had not joined the fight to defend Hogwarts. They were searching for Harry Potter at Voldemort's command. Draco, though conflicted, still walked the path of cowardice, unable to choose sides. Goyle was bewildered, following Draco's lead as always. But Crabbe, he made a choice. He reached deep into his limited magical arsenal and pulled forth the darkest tool he knew. He didn't want capture. He didn't want negotiation. He wanted annihilation. Ironically, in trying to eliminate Harry, Crabbe achieved the opposite. As the fiend fire swallowed shelves and cursed items, it also located and destroyed the Horcrux they were looking for. The lost diadem of Ravenclaw, a relic infused with Voldemort's soul. The flames, wild and indiscriminate, accomplished what Dumbledore's army could not. They obliterated a piece of the Dark Lord. Not that Crabbe knew or cared. "He's crazy!" Hermione screamed as the flames rose higher. It was not an accusation but a diagnosis, because no one sane would summon fiend fire in a sealed room. There was no exit strategy, no protective charm ready. Crabbe lit the match and stood in the gasoline. And it cost him everything. His death wasn't noble, it wasn't redemptive. As Harry, Ron, Hermione, and the surviving Slytherins soared above the fire on broomsticks, Crabbe disappeared beneath the burning floor. One scream, one mistake, one lost boy whose anger burned brighter than his judgment. Crabbe was dancing in fire he couldn't control, Harry later recalled, and he didn't even know the steps. What made Crabbe's decision so jarring was its absolute absence of strategy. Malfoy, for all his cowardice, always acted from fear or pressure. Goyle never acted at all. But Crabbe, in that moment, he stepped forward as the self-proclaimed executor of destruction. It was supposed to be his rise. Instead, it was his fall, quite literally, into the chasm he created. J.K. Rowling's text does not romanticize the moment. Crabbe was not quick enough. The fiery serpent was upon him, and he vanished as it engulfed him. There's no poetry, no mercy, just reality. The fiend fire does not spare fools. The room of requirement, filled with centuries of magic, burns like paper. It's worth analyzing why Crabbe chose this path. Was it blind panic? A desire to impress Malfoy? Revenge? There's a theory among scholars of magical psychology that some dark spells call to those already near a psychological edge. Fiendfire, in this view, isn't just a weapon, it's a mirror. Crabbe's inner chaos found form, and in casting the spell, he became the fire he unleashed. Draco's reaction is telling. Though often portrayed as a bully, Draco shows genuine horror as the fire grows. He doesn't cheer or command, he stumbles, he hesitates. It is the first time Draco sees what real darkness looks like. Something that doesn't care about blood status or family ties. Fire doesn't know allegiance, it just consumes. The Room of Requirement's destruction wasn't just physical, it symbolized the loss of something sacred in Hogwarts. The room had been a space of resistance, growth, and hope. Dumbledore's army trained there, the Order found refuge there. But now, thanks to Crabbe's recklessness, it was reduced to ash. The damage was not just collateral, it was irreversible. And what's most ironic is that this wasn't necessary. Harry was cornered. Malfoy could have disarmed him. Goyle might have tackled Ron. A dozen outcomes could have led to success. But Crabbe chose extinction. He didn't just raise the stakes, he flipped the entire game board and set it on fire. There's something Shakespearean in the moment. A tragic character with limited understanding plays with forces beyond his comprehension. He falls, not because he is evil, but because he mistakes power for wisdom. Crabbe didn't want to lose, but he didn't know how to win either. His only tool was destruction. Number 17, Dolores Umbridge, wearing the locket. Few decisions in the wizarding world have ever been as quietly disastrous and as strangely overlooked as Dolores Umbridge's choice to wear the locket of Salazar Slytherin. In a world filled with dark magic and sinister artifact, her act stood as a perfect example of arrogance entangled with ignorance. The pink-clad enforcer of magical law, always obsessed with control, discipline, and the illusion of moral superiority, unknowingly tethered herself to one of Lord Voldemort's most dangerous creations, a Horcrux. Her transformation into something more monstrous than ever before wasn't a descent into evil, it was an acceleration of what already lived inside her, catalyzed by the darkest magic imaginable. After the chaos in the Department of Mysteries, where she had suffered humiliation at the hands of centaurs and her power began to unravel, Umbridge attempted to reclaim her authority in a new context. The Ministry of Magic, increasingly influenced by Voldemort's regime, welcomed those who could enforce order with brutality. Umbridge, ever eager to rise, embedded herself within the new structure, as if it were no different than a pink doily on her desk. In this time of shifting power and shadowed allegiances, she came into possession of the locket, a gold, ornate piece emblazoned with a serpentine S. It was found among the stolen valuables of Muggleborns being interrogated. The Ministry's Artifact Division had no clue what it truly was, but Umbridge, seeing its rich finish and noble design, took it for herself. A symbol of pure blood superiority, she thought, a perfect accessory to wear during her blood status trials. What she did not realize or refused to consider was that the locket was humming with an unnatural force. It was not merely an heirloom, it pulsed with malice. This was not the trinket of some long-dead nobleman. It was a Horcrux, a fragment of Voldemort's own soul, created through murder and sustained by pain. While Harry, Ron and Hermione wore it only in short intervals and felt its poison, rage, paranoia, despair, eat away at their sanity, Umbridge wore it proudly, daily, unaware. Or perhaps more disturbingly, she noticed something change inside her and welcomed it. Even to someone untrained in the nuances of dark magic, the locket exuded a kind of cold pressure. It tightened the air around it. The longer it remained on the skin, the more it consumed. She was puffed up and glaring, the locket gleaming on her chest, Harry noted in Deathly Hallows during their infiltration of the Ministry. She had become more militant, more cruel than ever before, screaming accusations, inflicting punishments, and reveling in her unchecked power. The medallion didn't make her evil, but it fed her worst instincts and stripped away what little remained of human restraint. It is easy to dismiss Umbridge as simply another pawn of the Ministry, or even a background villain next to the grandeur of Voldemort. But the locket gave her something more than position. It gave her a false sense of destiny. As she wore it, she claimed descent from the Selwyn family, one of the sacred 28. This was a lie, of course, but the locket gave her the boldness to declare it. She was not content to act on behalf of power. She wanted to become it. In her mind, the medallion did not represent darkness. It represented legitimacy. What makes this choice so chilling is not merely its recklessness, but its implication. Umbridge was not afraid of power she didn't understand. She never sought to know the locket's origin. She did not question its whispers, its chill, the way it made her lips curl more tightly, the way her eyes began to dart with suspicion. She did not wonder why she began to enjoy the suffering of others more deeply, nor why she grew incapable of sleep without clutching it like a talisman. She simply accepted it because it made her feel strong. In a twisted way, the locket found a fitting host. Unlike Harry, who wore it with reluctance and anguish, Umbridge embraced its energy like perfume. It complemented her. She was a woman who had always used law as a weapon, who had manipulated systems and language to enact cruelty while shielding herself behind regulation. The locket merely amplified her. With it she became judge, jury, and executioner, dispensing justice with a grotesque smile beneath portraits of cats. During the Muggleborn Registration Commission hearings, her demeanour turned darker than ever. Witnesses described her as sharp-eyed and dead calm, her voice like ice cracking underfoot. Her judgments were not legal rulings, they were condemnations born of prejudice and rage. She wielded the locket like a symbol of ancient blood, clutching it when announcing sentences. It gave her legitimacy in her own mind, but to others, especially the innocent witches and wizards she condemned, it made her terrifying. She wasn't a bureaucrat anymore, she was a fanatic. It is worth asking, why didn't anyone stop her? The answer is both simple and damning. She looked respectable. She wore heels, tailored robes, and an authoritative badge. She spoke calmly. The locket, so saturated with evil, looked regal. None of her colleagues at the Ministry dared question her. It was the very banality of her appearance, the prim decorum of her behaviour, that masked the rot beneath. This, perhaps, is what makes her more dangerous than Bellatrix Lestrange. Bellatrix was chaos, Umbridge was order corrupted. The irony is that Voldemort himself would never have trusted her. He was too paranoid to let anyone else possess a Horcrux knowingly. He hid them, guarded them. But Umbridge took it out in public. She flaunted it. And in doing so, she placed herself in peril. Had Voldemort discovered it, she might have died instantly. Horcruxes were not fashion items, they were fragments of a soul torn by murder. Her act was not only foolish, it was suicidal. Number 19, Karkarov, returning to England. Igor Karkarov had once knelt before the Dark Lord. He had spoken the unforgivable curses with unshaking lips, watched bodies fall, and proudly bore the dark mark burned into his forearm. But in the end, like many who wrapped themselves in the false power of Voldemort's promise, Karkarov betrayed him when the winds shifted. Faced with Azkaban, he broke under pressure. He gave names, many names, not enough to redeem his soul, but just enough to escape a lifetime among the Dementors. And then he ran. In the years that followed Voldemort's downfall, Karkarov faded into obscurity. He resurfaced only once, in a position that surprised many, headmaster of Durmstrang Institute, the Eastern European school known for its fascination with the dark arts. It was a fitting post for a man of his past, surrounded by students bred for ambition and strength. There, cloaked in furs and cold winds, he seemed untouchable. But as the signs of the Dark Lord's return began to stir, the disappearance of Bertha Jorkins, the tremors in the magical underground, Karkaroff's old fear returned with them. At the Triwizard Tournament in 1994, Karkarov arrived in Hogwarts with his students, unaware that this trip would unravel him. He sensed Voldemort's growing strength, and the dark mark on his arm began to burn faintly once again. "It has never been this clear, not since," he whispered to Severus Snape in the Goblet of Fire, a note of panic cracking through his carefully composed facade. That mark, a tether to a master long believed dead, was waking up, and so was his dread. Unlike others who were ignorant or skeptical, Karkarov knew. He knew. And what did he do with that knowledge burning in his skin? He fled, yes, but not into the depths of Eastern Europe, nor to a hidden magical village in the Amazon or the icy shadows of Antarctica. No, Karkarov made the baffling decision to return to the very country where Voldemort was regaining power. He drifted into the English countryside, hiding in remote huts and abandoned places, as though he believed he could outwit the Master of Serpents by simply ducking into the next shadow. It was not bravery, it was delusion. It is difficult to comprehend this decision without considering Karkarov's psyche. He was a man not driven by loyalty or ideology, but by fear and survival. He betrayed Voldemort to save his own skin. He took up a prestigious school post to shield himself with respectability. He ran not when Voldemort returned, but when the threat of personal retribution became undeniable. So why return to the eye of the storm? Why not vanish entirely? One theory suggests he believed that England, the very place of Voldemort's rise, would be so heavily watched by the Ministry and the Order of the Phoenix that Voldemort's agents wouldn't dare search there. A foolish hope. Another more tragic possibility is that Karkarov, in his cowardice, lacked the courage even to run far enough. His connections, his knowledge, his network, they all lay in Europe. Perhaps he didn't know how to disappear. Perhaps the world, so vast and unfamiliar, terrified him more than Voldemort himself. But if that were true, it speaks volumes about the mental imprisonment Voldemort had crafted around his followers. Karkarov, even when attempting to defy his master, could not escape the geographical and psychological confines of that dark past. He was tethered not only by the mark, but by fear, shame, and a lingering belief that hiding might suffice. And it didn't. His end came silently. In Half-Blood Prince, it is revealed almost offhandedly that his body was found in a shack, covered in snow, the dark mark hovering above, a signature left not just for vengeance, but as a message to others. Traitors will not be forgotten. There was no final battle, no desperate last stand, no plea for mercy. His death was cold, clinical, and inevitable. Just as he might have once carried out executions for the Dark Lord without hesitation, he now met the same justice, stripped of meaning or dignity. This is what makes Karkarov's choice so perplexing, so tragically foolish. He was no fool in intellect. He had read the signs clearly, accurately. He knew Voldemort better than most. He had once shared in the darkness and knew its appetite for revenge. Unlike the Ministry officials who denied the truth, unlike Cornelius Fudge, who called Harry Potter a liar, Karkarov did not deny. He panicked, and still, in all his accurate foresight, he chose the one path that led directly to death. What could he have done instead? Disappear entirely, seek refuge under a different identity, travel far, Australia, South America, perhaps even the magical enclaves in Tibet, destroy the mark if possible, or seek magical concealment, and most importantly, stay far, far from England, far from the Death Eaters, far from the ghost of the boy who lived, whose very presence would draw fire and fury from Voldemort's army. But Karkarov did not vanish. He did not change his name or his face. He merely hid, and not well enough. Voldemort's agents, ever loyal, ever cruel, found him, and in that they reminded the wizarding world that no betrayal would go unpunished. As Dumbledore warned in hushed tones, the time for denial was over. The bodies were already starting to fall. There is perhaps an element of poetic justice to Karkarov's death. He was not a man of principle, nor a martyr, nor even a particularly brave coward. He was a survivor who miscalculated the nature of the thing he once served. "You cannot bargain with Voldemort," Sirius Black once said. "You cannot run from him forever." Karkarov thought perhaps he could. For a while, he even succeeded. His time as headmaster of Durmstrang shows that Voldemort's defeat gave former Death Eaters room to reinvent themselves. But reinvention without redemption is a fragile disguise. Karkarov never sought forgiveness, never tried to truly distance himself from the ideology he once embraced. Even at Hogwarts during the tournament, he remained slippery, contemptuous, and elitist. He showed favoritism to Victor Crumb, dismissed Harry Potter, and clashed with Dumbledore at every turn. The shadows still clung to him. In a different light, Karkarov's death could be seen as a warning, a lesson in the cost of half measures. He had betrayed evil, yes, but only to save himself. He had run, but not far enough. He had changed course, but not completely, and Voldemort, whose cruelty was boundless and memory long, made sure that this kind of defection would be met with blood. Others, like Snape, walked the razor's edge with far more success, but they walked it with purpose and with cunning. Karkarov simply stumbled into it. Some have speculated that he may have believed Voldemort would be destroyed again, just as he had the first time. That his return was temporary, a brief terror before fading once more into myth. If so, then Karkarov's fatal flaw was hubris, the belief that Voldemort was just a man and that men could fall, be forgotten, be outlived. But Voldemort was no mere man. He was obsession, revenge, legacy. His return was not just possible, it was prophesied, sought after, feared. Karkarov underestimated the scope of the storm he saw rising on the horizon. Perhaps in his final days, hiding under some leaky roof in a moor-strewn corner of Britain, Karkarov regretted it all. Perhaps he imagined Durmstrang's cold halls, the students he once tutored, the security he had abandoned. Perhaps he replayed the moment in the courtroom when he named names. Antonin Dolohov, Travers, Mulciber, and wondered if betrayal had bought him time or simply delayed the inevitable. And perhaps as the door creaked open and he smelled the fire of wands and fury, he finally accepted that he had sealed his fate long ago. There was no funeral, no obituary in the Daily Prophet, no mourning at Durmstrang. Karkarov disappeared from the world the same way he had lived in it, in shadows, in whispers, on the wrong side of history. But his story lingers as a question for all who flirt with power and fear the price of treason. What use is foresight if it leads you to your own execution? What is knowledge worth if it does not save you? Igor Karkarov chose to hide near the fire instead of escaping into the cold. He chose the familiar soil of England over the alien landscapes where he might have lived unseen. He knew Voldemort. He knew death was coming. But some part of him, arrogant, broken, or perhaps simply tired, could not take the last step into the unknown. Number 20, Augustus Rookwood, leaking information to the Ministry. Of all the Death Eaters who wormed their way into the structures of magical society, few infiltrated as deeply as Augustus Rookwood. He was not a mindless brute like Fenrir Greyback, nor a fanatical sadist like Bellatrix Lestrange. Rookwood was the thinking man's spy, methodical, cold, and terrifyingly efficient. Unlike many of Voldemort's followers who relied on sheer intimidation or bloodline superiority, Rookwood understood that knowledge was the sharpest weapon in a wizard's arsenal. He cultivated an image of loyalty to the Ministry of Magic, working for years in the Department of Mysteries, surrounded by secrets few dared even to question. It was a perfect cover, and for a while it worked brilliantly. He passed information in careful increments, never too much, never too obvious. He'd built a web of low-level sympathizers and took advantage of their blind spots. From time to time, a minor detail would leak, a name, a schedule, a piece of legislation being considered in the Wizengamot. Voldemort cherished this inside information, using it to anticipate raids, evade surveillance, and even manipulate broader ministry policy. Rookwood's intelligence helped Death Eaters appear omniscient, orchestrating chaos with eerie precision. His success only further cemented his belief that he was indispensable, and that, ultimately, would be his downfall. Rookwood's turning point came shortly before the First Wizarding War reached its apex. Perhaps it was the weight of expectation or the hunger for recognition. Perhaps more dangerously, he had begun to believe in his own infallibility. While the Dark Lord worked from the shadows, Rookwood grew bold. He began supplying information at an accelerated rate, critical intelligence that should have been impossible for a mid-level employee to obtain without drawing suspicion. Albus Dumbledore later remarked that the darkest loyalties often hide in the plainest places, and Rookwood, once a ghost in the bureaucracy, became a glaring spectre. His behavior raised red flags even among his colleagues. Bartemius Crouch Sr., then head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, received a series of anonymous tips suggesting internal leaks. The tipping point came when Aura Frank Longbottom stumbled upon a trail of communications that, when traced back, all pointed to the Department of Mysteries. With rising tensions and multiple raids failing inexplicably, the Ministry was on high alert. Surveillance was intensified, files were reviewed, and in the shadows, Rookwood's recklessness unfolded. One particular incident stood out. A top-secret Aura operation aimed at uncovering a hidden Death Eater cell in Nocturne Alley was compromised. The team, led by Alastair Moody, had barely disapparated when their cover was blown. The ambush was too perfect to be coincidence. As Moody later told the Wizengamot, they were waiting for us. Someone told them, and that someone had access to the Ministry's internal schedule. The file containing the mission's timing and details was restricted to 5 individuals. Augustus Rookwood was one of them. Even his allies began to question his motives. There are whispers in the darker corners of Nocturne Alley that Rookwood's eagerness to please Voldemort had become pathological. His need to be seen as the most valuable servant, the most useful weapon, began overriding his caution. He became sloppy, not in his methods, but in his visibility. He started skipping layers of obfuscation that once protected him. Instead of passing information through intermediaries, he began using enchanted notes delivered directly to known Death Eaters. This was a fatal mistake. The Ministry's breakthrough came when a low-level clerk, Reginald Cresswell, noticed a pattern of unauthorized file access from Rookwood's department. When cross-referenced with field failures, the correlation was damning. Under intense pressure, Cresswell reported his findings to Amelia Bones, who initiated a covert investigation. For weeks, Rookwood was unknowingly monitored. His movements, correspondences, even the charms he placed on his office door were all recorded. It didn't take long before the Department of Magical Law Enforcement had enough evidence to act. Rookwood was arrested in the Ministry itself, an irony not lost on anyone. Dragged from his office under the weight of his own arrogance, he didn't resist. That, perhaps, was the strangest part. He seemed calm, almost relieved. There was no grand display, no attempt to escape, only a faint, bitter smirk as he was led away. In his silence was a tacit admission. He had played the game too hard and too fast. During his trial, his betrayal was fully exposed. It became clear just how much he had given away: deployment plans, internal security procedures, and names of undercover auras. His testimonies, offered only after his imprisonment in Azkaban, included chilling admissions. He had known the risk. He had simply believed he was too important to fall. "The Dark Lord trusted me," he reportedly said. "I had access no one else did. I thought that made me untouchable." His voice, hollow and without remorse, only deepened the courtroom's silence. Perhaps what made Rookwood's story so unsettling was the way it blurred the line between villain and bureaucrat. He wasn't a sadist. He wasn't driven by blood purity or personal vengeance. He was a man who served darkness through documentation, espionage, and cold calculation. In the same way a scribe can shape a war with a single clause, Rookwood shaped a conflict from within the walls of the very institution designed to stop it. It was the perfect subversion of trust. The wizarding world has always been susceptible to internal threats. From the betrayal of Peter Pettigrew to the manipulations of Dolores Umbridge, the enemy within is more dangerous than the enemy without. Rookwood's betrayal fit this pattern: a quiet corrosion of trust, a slow poisoning of structure, and in that sense he was perhaps one of the most effective weapons Voldemort ever wielded. The Department of Mysteries, after his arrest, underwent a massive internal restructuring. Security protocols were rewritten, access levels were restricted further. The knowledge that a Death Eater had operated freely in one of the Ministry's most secretive departments left scars that would last for decades. Even years later, when Harry Potter visited the department as an adult, echoes of Rookwood's betrayal still lingered in the shadows. Interestingly, Rookwood's actions inspired an entire generation of spies, both dark and light. His career became a case study at the Aura Training Academy, where cadets were taught how bureaucracy could be twisted into a weapon. "Trust," Kingsley Shacklebolt once said in a lecture, "is earned, not assumed. Remember Rookwood." It became an unofficial motto, and yet his legacy is one of failure. For all his intelligence, his loyalty, his precision, Rookwood overplayed his hand. He gave too much too soon, and in doing so undermined the very secrecy that kept him safe. His self-assurance blinded him. In the end, he wasn't defeated by a duel or an ambush, but by his own belief in his invincibility. There is a peculiar poetry in that, a man of secrets undone by his inability to keep one. In the final days of the First Wizarding War, his arrest was a rare moment of clarity for the Ministry. It served as proof that not all enemies wore masks. Some wore ministry robes, carried memos, and filed reports. Some shook your hand while marking you for death. Augustus Rookwood was not the most feared Death Eater, but he was among the most dangerous because he made betrayal seem ordinary. He died in Azkaban many years later, long after Voldemort's final defeat, forgotten by most, remembered only in footnotes and archives. But his story is not just one of treachery, it's a cautionary tale about overconfidence, about the dangers of believing oneself to be above suspicion. Even the most brilliant traitor can fall, especially when he stops hiding. And Rookwood did stop hiding. That was his greatest mistake, not passing secrets, but doing so openly, brazenly, with the air of a man convinced he was irreplaceable. In that delusion lay his doom. It is a rule of war, magical or not, no one is irreplaceable, and arrogance kills faster than any curse. Would you like a follow-up article about how Rookwood was used by Voldemort despite his belief in his own importance? Number 21, Tom Riddle, killing Hepzibah Smith. Tom Riddle was always patient until he wasn't. That is the paradox at the heart of the murder of Hepzibah Smith. In the timeline of Lord Voldemort's rise, there are decisions that radiate cunning and restraint, and then there are moments that betray a youth intoxicated by his own ambitions. Hepzibah Smith's death belongs to the latter. Though cloaked in apparent precision, it was an act too rash, too loud, and ultimately too revealing. The young man who entered Hepzibah's ornate home in the 1940s was not a brute. He was a handsome, polite clerk at Borgin and Burke's, the kind any aristocratic collector of magical artifacts would be thrilled to welcome. And Hepzibah, vain, wealthy, and dangerously trusting, was certainly thrilled. She adored beautiful things, and Tom Riddle was very beautiful. She flattered herself that he came for her company as much as for the treasures she hoarded behind enchanted glass. In truth, he had long set his eyes on two items in her possession, Helga Hufflepuff's cup and Salazar Slytherin's locket. The locket had once belonged to Merope Gaunt, Tom's mother, and finding it again must have felt like claiming the dignity he believed he had been denied. But it was the cup that tempted him most. It gleamed with the heavy radiance of ancient magic, its surface marked with the badger of Hufflepuff House, a sacred relic passed down through centuries. It was powerful, it was legendary, and most importantly, it could become his. Yet Tom could have had them both without blood. He could have coaxed them from her slowly, manipulating her sense of pride, her loneliness, her vanity. She showed him the cup and locket without hesitation. How much longer before she would have entrusted them to him willingly? But, in a moment of violent impulse, he poisoned her, framed her loyal house elf Hokey, and disappeared with both items. The murder was clean in execution, but dirty in its long-term consequences. Madam Smith was old, certainly, but not feeble, Dumbledore would later reflect, when examining the peculiar circumstances of her death. The news of her demise, published in the Daily Prophet, rippled across the wizarding community. Her status as a collector of historical artifacts made her death a matter of public interest. Her name was known, and she had spoken too freely of her collection. Her murder was not easily forgotten, and neither was the mysterious young man who had visited her shortly before her death. Tom's decision was not a matter of necessity, but of pride. He wanted the cup, he wanted the locket, but more than that, he wanted another Horcrux. By killing Hepzibah, he fed his ambition and deepened his descent into soul mutilation, yet by doing so in such a high-profile way, he broke the careful invisibility he had cultivated for years. Until then, Tom Riddle had been a shadow, gifted, mysterious, but unthreatening. After Hepzibah's death, Dumbledore began to connect the dots. The choice of Hepzibah as a target reveals much about Tom's psychology at the time. He was in his early 20s, recently graduated from Hogwarts, still posing as a model wizard. His ambition, though vast, was wrapped in a flawless exterior. But that mask slipped the moment he chose murder over manipulation. The older Tom Riddle, the man who would become Lord Voldemort, rarely left behind such clumsy traces. He learned to act through proxies, through curses, through followers. But in this early moment, the boy's ego eclipsed the man's discipline. There's a passage in Half-Blood Prince that stands out. When Dumbledore shows Harry the memory of Hepzibah's final days, the young Tom's expression is telling. Riddle's eyes flashed red for a moment, the narration notes. That flash is the truth beneath the charm, the snake beneath the smile. He was delighted not just by the power of the artifacts, but by the idea of conquest. Hepzibah was not an obstacle, she was an offering. But even an offering must be handled with care. Hepzibah's death may have secured two relics, but it also awakened Dumbledore's suspicion. Dumbledore, ever the chess player, had long kept watch over Tom Riddle's progress. When news of a well-known collector dying under suspicious circumstances surfaced, and when it was discovered that Tom had recently visited her, the pattern was too precise to ignore. Though there was no proof, the suspicion festered. This moment marks a turning point, not in Voldemort's rise, but in the conditions that would lead to his fall. By drawing Dumbledore's attention, Tom accelerated the forces that would one day bring him down. The headmaster began asking questions, quietly gathering information, and keeping a closer watch. It's likely that without the murder of Hepzibah, Dumbledore might not have been as prepared years later when Voldemort finally declared himself. And the irony is bitter. In his lust for immortality, Tom made himself mortal. Every Horcrux brought him closer to death, not further, and Hepzibah Smith's death, so unnecessary, so dramatic, was the most telling of all. A wizard with his cunning could have achieved his aims silently. But Tom was not yet Voldemort. He was still learning, still erring. Hepzibah herself was not innocent, of course. She flaunted her wealth, bragged of her collection, and kept dark artifacts as trophies. Her pride blinded her. She allowed Tom into her home because she wanted to be admired, but her flaws did not warrant murder. She died because a young man wanted a piece of her soul to stitch into his own. Hokey, her house elf, suffered terribly in the aftermath. Under the influence of a memory-altering charm, she believed herself guilty. This cruelty, manipulating a loyal servant into thinking she had poisoned her mistress, reveals Tom's willingness to not just destroy but corrupt. He left no room for truth to emerge. It wasn't just about killing Hepzibah, it was about burying her story. The Ministry accepted Hokey's confession, case closed. But for Dumbledore, the case had just opened. He later said he showed no remorse at all. He was perhaps the most brilliant student Hogwarts ever had, but also the most dangerous. That brilliance, that cold detachment, became his legacy. And yet Hepzibah's death showed cracks in the facade. He wasn't as untouchable as he believed. The artifacts themselves carried the weight of her murder. The cup, hidden in the Lestrange vault at Gringotts, and the locket, stashed in a cave by the sea, both were touched by that first major betrayal. The curses placed on them were fierce but not unbreakable. They carried not just pieces of soul, but the echo of Tom's youth, of a mistake that made him visible to his enemies. In this, perhaps, lies the lesson. Voldemort, for all his brilliance, made human errors. He overestimated his control, underestimated attention. He believed in the permanence of fear, the silence of death. But some deaths speak louder than life. Hepzibah's did. Her absence rang alarms in the one man Tom feared most. It's tempting to see Voldemort as a being born from cruelty alone. But he was also shaped by impatience, by vanity. The murder of Hepzibah Smith is not the story of a master planner. It is the story of a boy too eager to become a god, and gods, as myths teach us, often fall because of one rash act. Years later, as Voldemort stood in the ruins of his plans, shattered by the very Horcruxes he believed made him immortal, perhaps he remembered her face, not with guilt, but with regret. Because had he waited just a few months, a few conversations more, he might have had everything and remained unseen. But he didn't wait, and that mistake, born in a parlour filled with antiques and vanity, may have cost him more than he ever understood. Number 22, Nagini, interfering in the Battle of Hogwarts. Of all the choices Voldemort made in his desperate final days, few were as bizarrely reckless as his decision to bring Nagini into the thick of the Battle of Hogwarts. As a serpent, she was lethal. As a Horcrux, she was sacred. But to Voldemort, she was both a deadly weapon and the fragile anchor of his divided soul. Her presence at the climax of the Wizarding World's greatest battle was not a testament to confidence. It was a glaring miscalculation, one that cost him everything. And yet, at the time, it must have seemed perfectly logical to a man who no longer understood fear in its human form. Voldemort's obsession with power made him blind to the weight of strategy. He had spent years tearing through centuries of magical history, manipulating death itself, and building his Horcruxes like a mad alchemist sealing away pieces of his corrupted soul. By the time of the final battle, only Nagini remained, swathed in enchantments and held close, suspended in a protective floating bubble as he wandered through the ruins of Hogwarts. She was both a comfort and a weakness, wrapped around his dark ambitions like a crown of thorns. Her proximity, however, betrayed a truth Voldemort refused to acknowledge. He still feared death, and so he kept death's safeguard within reach. Yet, keeping Nagini by his side was not merely about sentimentality or magical control. Voldemort had witnessed the systematic destruction of his Horcruxes. The diary, the locket, the cup, the ring, even the lost diadem of Ravenclaw, all had been found and shattered by Potter's resistance. He knew, or at least suspected, that Nagini was the last tether. He guarded her jealously, but he guarded her in the open, turning the battlefield into a display of pride rather than caution. In his mind, perhaps, the idea that anyone could reach Nagini was unthinkable. He was wrong. The spell he cast around her, described in the book as a protective sphere, gleaming like a bubble of glass around her, was strong, but it was not impenetrable, and its very existence served as an invitation. It shouted, "Here lies something precious." Why else would the Dark Lord shield a simple snake in battle? To those watching, it became clear she was no ordinary familiar. Neville Longbottom understood this. Harry, too, began to suspect it. Voldemort had revealed more than he intended, and in doing so had given his enemies a target. There was, of course, precedent in his paranoia. When Dumbledore destroyed the ring, Marvolo Gaunt's heirloom, it had cursed him. When the diary was stabbed by Basilisk Fang, it leaked memory and malevolence into the air. Voldemort knew now that the destruction of a Horcrux meant more than inconvenience. It meant unravelling. Each time he had grown weaker, less stable, less whole. By the time only Nagini remained, his magic was no longer just cruel. It was desperate. And desperation makes strange generals of even the most cunning minds. The decision to keep Nagini close was, at best, self-sabotage. The Battle of Hogwarts was chaos incarnate. Giants roamed the grounds, acromantulas poured from the forbidden forest. Spells collided like meteors in the sky. Children fought, professors bled, and in the heart of it all, Voldemort paced, dragging Nagini behind him in a magical sphere like a queen carried in a glass coffin. It was theatre. And theatre in war is dangerous, let us remember. Voldemort had safe houses. He had devoted followers still operating in shadows. If protection had truly been his concern, he could have hidden Nagini in the deepest vaults of Gringotts, beneath the waves of the Black Lake, or far beyond the continent in enchanted oblivion. Instead, he placed her where all could see, trusting in her protective bubble more than he ever trusted his own Death Eaters. Even Bellatrix, his most loyal, had never been granted such a position of intimacy. Nagini was always there, curled at his feet, watching with alien eyes. But it was not love that bound Voldemort to her. It was control. He had long ago learned the secret of the serpent tongue. Parseltongue made her his confidant, his weapon. In his fractured soul, he had given her a piece of himself, literally, and in return she had become more than just a snake. She was, as Dumbledore had once guessed, something more, perhaps even a vessel. The tragedy was that Voldemort, in his arrogance, believed this made her invincible, and still her presence on the battlefield was a looming invitation to fate. Neville Longbottom, once the clumsy boy forgotten in corners, rose to his moment of destiny. The Sorting Hat yielded the sword of Gryffindor, not because Neville asked, but because it saw the need. The sword, created by goblins and imbued with the power to destroy Horcruxes, appeared as a judgment. Neville, the narration tells us, charged forward. In that instant, Voldemort was distracted, his attention pulled away from the serpent's sphere. He had miscalculated not only the threat, but the timing. Nagini's death was not a slow unravelling. It was decisive, brutal, and poetic. One stroke of the sword, and the Horcrux within her was obliterated. The slash of the blade was like a scream through the air, the book says, and that scream echoed through Voldemort's entire being. He had built himself into a god, and in one motion the god was unmade. The protective bubble had not mattered, the spells had not mattered. All that remained was the final reckoning. In the aftermath, Voldemort continued to fight, but the myth had broken. For years he had ruled through fear and whispers. His survival had seemed unnatural, eternal. But with Nagini gone, his mortality returned. The followers who had once trembled at his name now looked at him with uncertainty. He was just a man, a powerful man, yes, but mortal. And in a war of symbols, that change in perception is more fatal than any spell. It is worth asking why Voldemort, so brilliant and meticulous in his earlier campaigns, would gamble so recklessly with the final piece of his soul. The answer lies in the very thing he tried to destroy, human connection. Love, fear, empathy, these were things he had stripped from himself. Without them, he could not understand sacrifice. He could not imagine someone like Neville risking death to strike down a snake. He could not predict Harry offering himself willingly in the forest, nor could he grasp the loyalty between those who fought for each other rather than out of fear. This blindness, more than any spell, was his undoing. It made him underestimate the resilience of others and overestimate his own invincibility. Nagini was not just a Horcrux, she was a mirror. In her he saw his own power, his own cunning, his own permanence. But mirrors, when shattered, reflect nothing. When Neville killed her, Voldemort didn't just lose a piece of his soul, he lost the illusion. In a perverse twist of irony, it was Nagini's visibility that made her vulnerable. Had she remained in the shadows, in the darkened corners of some cursed vault, her end might have come later, or not at all. But Voldemort had turned her into a symbol, and symbols, once revealed, are meant to be broken. Her glass bubble became her tomb. Perhaps the final tragedy of Nagini's involvement in the Battle of Hogwarts is that she never truly had a choice. In the film's lore and the Fantastic Beasts series, we glimpse hints of a time when she was a woman, cursed to transform into a snake permanently. If this version holds truth, then her fate is darker still, enslaved not only by spell and language but by destiny itself. Voldemort did not see her humanity. He saw a weapon. And weapons are meant to be wielded until they break. Thus, when the battle reached its crescendo and Voldemort stood face to face with Harry once more, he did so alone, not because he lacked followers, but because he had destroyed every true bond. In the silence after Nagini's death, the world tilted. Harry's final stand became less about spells and more about legacy. Voldemort's had been built on fear. Harry's was built on love. So we return to the central question: why bring Nagini into the battle? Why risk the last Horcrux in open warfare? The answer lies not in logic, but in pathology. Voldemort was a master of dark magic, but he was a novice of the heart. He believed that power lay in proximity, in dominance, in spectacle. He believed that a glowing bubble was safer than trust, that fear was stronger than faith. He was wrong. In that critical moment when Neville lifted the sword, Voldemort's illusion cracked. The carefully constructed fortress of his soul collapsed brick by brick. And Nagini, the coiled guardian of his false immortality, fell not with a hiss, but with silence. The silence of a mistake realized too late. The downfall of the Dark Lord did not begin with a wand. It began with a decision, a flawed, prideful decision to bring a secret into the open and dare the world to strike it. And strike it they did. Number 23, Bartemius Crouch Sr., sending his son to Azkaban. There are decisions in the wizarding world that echo not only through courtrooms and ministry corridors, but through time itself. One such decision was made by Barty Crouch Sr., a man whose name once commanded respect and fear in equal measure. His choice to send his own son to Azkaban, not out of justice but out of political self-preservation, stands as one of the most chilling examples of what happens when law is placed above love and order above understanding. Barty Crouch Sr. was a symbol of unbending authority. As head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement during the height of the First Wizarding War, he became known for his iron will and zero-tolerance policies toward the followers of Lord Voldemort. Crouch was efficient, ruthless, and fanatically devoted to the rule of law. Under his hand, captured Death Eaters were sent to Azkaban without trial, and his interpretation of justice blurred into vengeance. It was this rigid worldview that led to the destruction of his family. When the young Barty Crouch Jr. was arrested alongside Bellatrix Lestrange and her husband Rodolphus for the torture of Frank and Alice Longbottom, the wizarding world recoiled. The Lestranges were already infamous, but Crouch's name being tied to a Death Eater scandal sent shockwaves through the ministry. To most, the revelation was a betrayal. To Barty Sr., it was a catastrophe that threatened to undo years of work and ambition. He did not waver. He demanded no leniency. He stood in the courtroom as his son begged, cried, and swore innocence, and he pronounced the sentence himself. "He's no son of mine," Barty Crouch Sr. declared coldly, unmoved by his son's sobs. The ministry's halls remembered the scene for years. Witnesses said his voice did not tremble, not once. In Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, Dumbledore confirms this event with quiet sorrow, telling Harry he sentenced his own son to Azkaban. The boy had been caught with a group of Death Eaters who tortured Frank and Alice Longbottom. But in that courtroom, what mattered to Crouch wasn't guilt beyond doubt, nor the soul of a confused young man. What mattered was image. It is worth noting that the evidence against Barty Jr. was circumstantial at best. He had been found in the company of Bellatrix Lestrange, yes, but he maintained he had never participated in the torturing. Even his mother believed in his innocence, and her pleas were desperate and heartfelt. But Barty Sr., knowing that the political climate demanded swift, merciless justice, sacrificed his son on the altar of public opinion. This wasn't justice, it was containment, a message, a statement that even a Crouch would burn if he wore the mark. This decision, born of fear and obsession, did not prevent Crouch's fall from grace. It accelerated it. After sentencing his son, public sympathy quickly turned to unease. The man who sent innocents to a prison guarded by soul-draining dementors lost his humanity in the eyes of many. When his wife, heartbroken and dying, begged to see her son once more, Crouch agreed, but again, not out of love. The visit to Azkaban was orchestrated not as a final goodbye, but as a covert operation. Barty Sr. allowed his wife to switch places with their son using Polyjuice potion. She died in his cell while the true Barty Jr. was hidden in his family home under the Imperious curse. In saving his son from Azkaban only to imprison him again in their own home, Crouch's moral failure doubled. The same man who once stood as the face of magical law now broke every rule he had enforced. He concealed the escape, manipulated magical boundaries, and enslaved his own child, though whether out of guilt or desperation remains unclear. This contradiction is perhaps the most damning aspect of Crouch's character. He believed so completely in order that he could not allow himself to confront the disorder within his own home. The imprisonment of Barty Jr. was not rehabilitation, it was control. For years, Crouch kept his son hidden under the watch of Winky, the family's house elf, and maintained the illusion of a perfectly ordered life. But cracks formed quickly. Barty Jr. was not a reformed man. He was a time bomb. And Crouch, too stubborn to seek help or admit fault, refused to see the danger growing under his own roof. Madness, Dumbledore later called it. Madness and greatness are two sides of the same coin. In Crouch's case, his madness was cloaked in logic, in routine, in silence. When Voldemort returned and sought to rebuild his forces, it was through the weakness of men like Crouch that he found openings. Barty Jr., still under Imperius, was eventually freed by Voldemort's agents, using the ever-loyal Winky's unintended help. What followed was one of the darkest betrayals in the series, the impersonation of Alistair Moody, the infiltration of Hogwarts, and the manipulation of the Triwizard Tournament to deliver Harry Potter directly to Voldemort's reborn form. And at the center of it all, Barty Crouch Jr., embittered, fanatical, and still loyal to the Dark Lord. Had Crouch Sr. handled his son's situation with care, had he pursued truth rather than appearances, perhaps this tragedy could have been avoided. Perhaps Barty Jr. might have been reached before Voldemort could reclaim him. The brutality of Azkaban, followed by years of magical enslavement, did not break Barty Jr. It completed his transformation into a creature of vengeance. The sins of the father did not cleanse the son. They created the monster that would later return to Hogwarts in disguise, nearly killing Harry and endangering the entire wizarding world. This is the true cruelty of Crouch's decision. It was not merely that he punished his son too harshly, it's that he allowed no room for redemption. In Barty Sr.'s world, there were only the obedient and the condemned. He placed himself above judgment, above emotion, and in doing so lost everything: his wife, his son, his position, and finally his life. When Barty Jr. murdered his father after luring him out and transfiguring his body into a bone, it was a poetic, albeit horrifying, conclusion. A man who once defined himself by his control was undone by the very thing he tried to lock away. There is no evidence that Barty Crouch Sr. ever expressed regret. He reappears in the series only to fall apart, plagued by the after-effects of magical torture and his own collapse. He is found wandering, confused, speaking nonsense, his eyes haunted. "He's mad," Sirius Black tells Harry, "stuffed full of Imperius and Confundus. They've been controlling him for weeks." The once proud magistrate had become a shell. It is a haunting metaphor for what happens when one confuses obedience with righteousness. The wizarding world is full of complex figures, but few are as tragically blind as Barty Crouch Sr. His downfall was not caused by external enemies, but by his inability to reconcile law with compassion. His son's actions were undoubtedly evil, but Crouch's response was not heroic. It was cold, calculated, and ultimately self-defeating. The cruelty of his decision was that it ignored the possibility of change, the flicker of humanity in even the darkest hearts. That is not justice. That is fear, weaponized in the robes of a judge. In a world where so many characters grapple with the line between good and evil, Crouch remains uniquely disturbing because he never saw a line at all, only rules. And when those rules conflicted with the beating heart of his own family, he chose to extinguish the heart rather than question the law. His was not the open villainy of Voldemort, but a subtler, bureaucratic evil that wears a smile and signs death warrants in triplicate. One cannot read Barty Crouch Sr.'s story without feeling the icy sting of wasted potential. His brilliance, his dedication, and his influence could have reshaped the Ministry in noble ways. Instead, they became the tools of repression. In his crusade against Voldemort's chaos, he became an architect of a different kind of darkness, one made not of shadows and curses, but of silence and shame. The tragedy of Crouch is that he saw himself as a guardian of the realm. He believed he was making the hard choices others couldn't bear. And perhaps that belief is what kept him from ever seeking redemption. But power, even righteous power, becomes dangerous when wielded without mercy. It creates men like Crouch. It creates prisons like Azkaban. And it creates sons who grow into monsters, not despite their fathers, but because of them. In the Goblet of Fire, as Barty Jr. confesses under Verite Serum, we see no remorse, only pride. "I would have done anything for my master," he tells Dumbledore, unblinking. It is chilling not only because of the words, but because of what they reveal. Crouch Sr.'s attempts to crush Voldemort's influence had the opposite effect. He forged in his son the perfect servant of the Dark Lord, disillusioned, abandoned, and driven by fury. Thus the story of Barty Crouch Sr. stands not just as a tale of justice gone awry, but as a mirror for the wizarding world itself. In every ministry corridor, in every courtroom that values rules over reason, his legacy lingers. The name Crouch does not inspire admiration. It inspires unease, a reminder that even those who fight darkness can become part of it if they forget what makes the fight worth waging in the first place. It's easy to vilify Voldemort. It's harder to confront the silent enablers, the men who followed every rule and still destroyed everything. Barty Crouch Sr. was not evil in the way the Death Eaters were. He was worse. He believed he was right. He believed he was saving the world. And in that belief, he became one of its quietest, most devastating villains. Would Barty Jr. have become a killer had his father reached out instead of recoiled? Would he have chosen differently if the courtroom hadn't turned into a theatre of abandonment? These are questions the books never answer. But they hang in the air, unsettling and unshakable whenever the name Crouch is spoken. In the end, the true crime was not Barty Jr.'s alone. It began with a sentence. It ended with a silence. And it cost the wizarding world dearly. Number 24, Death Eaters, theatrics in their infiltration of Hogwarts. Of all the miscalculations made by Voldemort's followers, the infiltration of Hogwarts in the Half-Blood Prince stands as one of the most dramatic and most strategically flawed. The Death Eaters, powerful and feared, finally pierced the walls of the wizarding world's most sacred sanctuary. But instead of executing a swift, silent assassination, they turned the operation into a theatrical performance. Their target, Albus Dumbledore, was indeed eliminated, and yet the aftermath left them weaker, exposed, and, ironically, vulnerable. This was not a triumph, it was a self-inflicted wound masked as a victory. Draco Malfoy, barely 16, was entrusted with a task that would terrify even seasoned Death Eaters. His mission was never just about murder, it was a test of loyalty, an elaborate punishment for Lucius Malfoy's failures. Voldemort knew Draco might fail, and that was part of the plan, but still, the boy found a way. He used the Vanishing Cabinet, an overlooked relic hidden in the Room of Requirement, and repaired it. With that, he opened a door that should have never been opened, and through that door came chaos. The moment the Death Eaters set foot in Hogwarts, the nature of the mission changed. No longer content with discretion, they wandered the hallways, leaving a trail of fear and shattered illusions. They could have gone directly to the Astronomy Tower, taken Dumbledore by surprise, and disappeared like phantoms. Instead, they indulged in menace. Students were terrified, corridors vandalized, portraits slashed. This was not a surgical strike, it was performance art for the Dark Lord's amusement. The irony lies in the fact that Dumbledore was already dying. His fate was sealed long before that night. The ring Horcrux had cursed him, and Severus Snape had vowed to kill him when the time came. In fact, the headmaster had asked Snape to perform the deed, knowing that it would protect Draco's soul and solidify Snape's standing with Voldemort. A cleaner death, arranged in private, would have left the Order of the Phoenix confused and leaderless. But that wasn't what the Death Eaters delivered. By choosing spectacle over subtlety, they awakened the castle itself. Teachers like Professor McGonagall and Flitwick rushed to confront the intruders. Members of Dumbledore's army, long dormant, sprang into action. Even creatures that once lurked in the shadows, like the centaurs, sensed the change. The school, in all its ancient power, rejected the invaders. "There is no safer place," Dumbledore once said. That night, the castle tried to live up to that promise. And yet, the ultimate blunder was not in the attack itself, but in the consequences that followed. Severus Snape, arguably the most valuable double agent in magical history, had to flee. With his cover blown and his presence linked undeniably to Dumbledore's death, he was forced into exile. The wizard who had Voldemort's trust and Dumbledore's confidence was gone from both sides. Whatever edge he offered the Death Eaters, tactical, magical, or psychological, was now reduced to a liability. The castle's secret passageways, once obscure, became known. The Vanishing Cabinet, long forgotten by most, was now revealed to be a portal for future assaults. These revelations compromised Hogwarts' very architecture. Future incursions could now be planned with greater knowledge, but even worse was the breach of trust. Hogwarts was never just a building, it was a symbol. And when it was breached, students and staff realized that nowhere was truly safe anymore. More damaging still, the attack cemented the myth of Dumbledore. In death, he became more powerful than ever. As Sirius had become a martyr to Harry, so now did Dumbledore become a rallying cry for the Order. The students who watched him fall were transformed. Neville Longbottom, once timid and awkward, began to rise. Luna Lovegood, always peculiar, found clarity in purpose. Even Seamus Finnegan, sceptical until the end, took up the fight. The Death Eaters had not silenced opposition, they had multiplied it. It's worth remembering that the magical world was on the edge of submission. The Ministry of Magic was compromised. Fear ruled the press. The Daily Prophet had become a puppet, and many witches and wizards were ready to bow to Voldemort if only for peace. A stealthy removal of Dumbledore, made to look like illness or accident, might have subdued the last embers of rebellion. Instead, The Death Eaters chose to burn a flag in front of the crowd, and the crowd remembered. The murder itself, though brutal, was almost merciful. "Severus, please," Dumbledore whispered, and Snape obeyed. It was not a moment of triumph, it was a transaction of pain. Draco had failed to complete his task, and in doing so he retained a fragment of innocence. But the show had cost the Death Eaters dearly. They had revealed Snape's role, they had shown their method, and they had underestimated the rage that would follow. Voldemort, of course, would not care. His obsession was never with strategy, it was with symbolism. He enjoyed the fear, the spectacle, the idea that no place was sacred, but in this he misunderstood the human heart. Fear does not last forever. Eventually it curdles into defiance, and defiance breeds resistance. The more he tightened his grip, the more hope bled through the cracks. The Carrows, sent to take control of Hogwarts afterward, found themselves fighting not students, but insurgents. Neville led the resistance from within the castle. The Room of Requirement became a refuge. Dumbledore's army returned, not as children, but as soldiers. And all of this began the night the Death Eaters decided to walk through the front door and parade their power. They didn't crush the next generation, they forged it. Some decisions in war look victorious at the surface. Dumbledore's death, after all, was a coup. But the larger campaign is fought in the minds of the people. And in the minds of Hogwarts' students, that night didn't break them. It galvanized them. Harry Potter, watching from the tower under his invisibility cloak, felt the powerlessness of inaction. But it lit a fire in him. He knew he could no longer rely on adults. He had to act. From that moment, the war became his. The mission to find Horcruxes, the final keys to Voldemort's destruction, was born in that grief. They didn't even try to fight, Harry later said, haunted by the memory of watching without interfering. But that wound became a weapon. He would never hesitate again. Bellatrix Lestrange, Fenrir Greyback, and the other Death Eaters had achieved their goal, but revealed too much of themselves in the process. Their faces were seen. Their tactics understood. Their taste for blood documented. The ministry may have looked away, but the people began to whisper. Families sent their children into hiding. Messages were passed in secret. The war had moved underground, and underground is where revolutions are born. Had the Death Eaters crept into the school, used poison or cursed objects and vanished without a trace, they might have left the order blind and broken. But they chose noise over silence, terror over cunning. Voldemort prized terror. But Dumbledore had warned of this. "You must be the one to kill me, Severus," he had said. "It is the only way." Because he knew that sacrifice made in quiet could plant seeds that noise could never scatter. Even the magical portraits were changed. Dumbledore's likeness, now ensconced in the headmaster's office, could still advise. The man they wanted to erase became omnipresent. His portrait helped guide Snape. His will sent Harry to the snitch. His past, revealed through the pensive, told the final story. And his legacy, love, as the final defense, only deepened. The decision to storm Hogwarts was a gamble, but it was also an ego trip. Voldemort never trusted subtlety. He believed in force. And in that force, he overlooked the hidden magic that binds people together. He mistook fear for loyalty, silence for consent. But the students of Hogwarts had been taught better. Even under tyranny, they remembered what Dumbledore stood for. They rebelled. The Death Eaters made the wrong call. They exposed their greatest secret weapon. They energized their enemies. They turned the next generation into warriors. And they showed that even in death, Dumbledore could win battles. Theatrics may please the audience, but in war, the quieter stroke often cuts deepest. Number 25. Trolls in the Dungeon, the Halloween Distraction. The events of Halloween night during Harry Potter's first year at Hogwarts were supposed to be memorable for pumpkin pasties and floating jack-o'-lanterns, not for a 12-foot mountain troll smashing through a girl's bathroom. And yet, beneath all the chaos and peril of that night, there lurks a mystery that deserves sharper scrutiny. What exactly was Professor Quirrell thinking? The plan to release a troll into Hogwarts as a mere diversion, an enormous, dim-witted, unpredictable beast, feels more like a clumsy afterthought than a carefully orchestrated piece of dark strategy. It is a villain's decision so dubious, so flawed in logic and consequence, that it warrants its own chapter in the compendium of magical missteps. At the core of this mystery lies a painfully simple goal. Professor Quirinius Quirrell, already compromised by Lord Voldemort's parasitic presence on the back of his head, needed to bypass the enchantments guarding the Philosopher's Stone. One of those enchantments, the three-headed dog named Fluffy, stood behind a locked trapdoor in a forbidden corridor on the 3rd floor. To reach it unnoticed, Quirrell needed a distraction. And so, on that fateful Halloween, he released a troll from the dungeons, a real, adult, full-grown mountain troll. The problem with this plan is not just its danger, but its inefficiency. As a method of distraction, the troll was noisy, violent, and impossible to control. Hogwarts, with its enchanted hallways and hidden chambers, offered infinite possibilities for deception. Magical illusions, a false alarm, a vanishing cabinet set to explode, any of these could have served the purpose of drawing teachers away. Quirrell, an accomplished wizard in his own right, might have bewitched an object or cast a subtle spell to mislead Dumbledore or Flitwick. But instead, he unleashed a creature known for clubbing everything in sight, including walls, suits of armor, and unsuspecting 11-year-olds. The outcome? Chaos far beyond his expectations. The troll did not skulk quietly in the dungeons. It lumbered upstairs, leaving a trail of broken stone and smashed torches. "Troll in the dungeons. Thought you ought to know," Quirrell had announced, collapsing theatrically during the Halloween feast. But as he fainted, pretending to be overwhelmed by fear, he sowed real panic. The great hall erupted in screams. Teachers leapt into action. First years stood stunned as McGonagall barked orders. The school was on the brink of a full-blown crisis. And for what? Let us not forget that Hogwarts was a place protected by dozens of skilled witches and wizards, many of whom had fought in the First Wizarding War. Professor McGonagall, a transfiguration expert with nerves of steel, Professor Flitwick, a master duelist, Professor Snape, capable of concocting antidotes and hexes in equal measure, all rushed into immediate motion. The idea that such minds would be so thoroughly distracted by a single troll seems almost insulting. Within minutes, they were sweeping through hallways and bathrooms, coordinating efforts to corner the beast. Quirrell may have expected confusion, but he underestimated the strength of the school's faculty. But the troll didn't just distract the adults. It very nearly killed 3 children. Hermione Granger, having run to the girls' bathroom in tears earlier that evening, found herself trapped in a chamber of stone with a mindless giant dragging a club. The line in the book is chilling in its simplicity. Hermione had sunk to the floor in fright. It was not until Harry and Ron rushed in, inexperienced, wand-waving first years, that the troll was subdued. Harry vaulted onto its back. Ron, in a moment of untested courage, levitated the troll's club and knocked it out. This moment cemented their friendship with Hermione, but it also exposed how reckless Quirrell's plan had been. He had come within inches of murdering students. It is worth remembering that Voldemort, possessing Quirrell at the time, was not known for mercy. The Dark Lord had killed children before. But the release of the troll seems less like a calculated risk and more like desperation. Voldemort had been reduced to drinking unicorn blood in the Forbidden Forest. He was not at full strength. He needed stealth. Drawing the entire school into alert mode ran counter to every goal he had. Worse still, the plan backfired in ways that Quirrell could not have predicted. Professor Snape, ever suspicious, seemed to grow more alert after the incident. Snape was limping, Harry noted, after catching a glimpse of him on Halloween night. What Harry didn't know then was that Snape had gone to guard the stone, and had been bitten by Fluffy in the process. Rather than distracting the staff, Quirrell's plan made them more vigilant. The attempt to slip past Fluffy that night failed, and now the professors knew someone was trying. The fallout rippled beyond that night. Hermione Granger, after being rescued, lied to protect Harry and Ron, saying that she had gone after the troll on her own. That lie and the bond it forged between the trio became the emotional spine of their future adventures. Quirrell's act of terrorism had, in a strange twist of fate, created the Golden Trio, the very team that would thwart him time and again. Nor did Dumbledore take the incident lightly. Though the headmaster appeared calm on the surface, he was no fool. Security measures around the stone were tightened. The trapdoor was now watched even more closely. Had Quirrell done nothing, the teachers might have let their guards slip. Instead, he reinforced their caution. The plan to steal the stone had been set back, not advanced. It was a move that drew attention instead of diverting it. There is also something absurd in the theatricality of it. If Quirrell sought to go unnoticed, why throw a Halloween horror show? He could have slipped a confundus charm onto Filch, or Imperius to portrait to mislead teachers down the wrong corridor. The use of raw force, the troll, betrayed a kind of magical clumsiness unbecoming of even a weak Death Eater. As readers, we must wonder if this was truly Voldemort's idea or a desperate lunge by a coward pretending to be clever. The troll, in its grotesque stupidity, became a metaphor for the entire plan. Uncontrolled, dangerous, loud, and stupid. Everything a proper distraction should not be. And in using it, Quirrell not only risked exposure but also revealed his hand. After the attack, Harry began to observe his professors more carefully. He started to suspect Snape, of course, but he was on the trail nonetheless. This night marked the beginning of Harry's deeper involvement in the mystery of the stone. The troll incident also forced Quirrell to be more cautious. He had played one card, and it had failed. The teachers were now watching each other. Whispers spread among portraits. Peeves, the poltergeist, always nosy, knew something was up. Even the ghosts murmured more frequently. The castle, ancient and alive, responded to threats. Hogwarts, as Dumbledore once hinted, has its own defences. And now it was awake. Even from Voldemort's point of view, the plan was flawed. He had returned to existence as a mere shadow, desperate for resurrection. Every step had to be precise, every movement hidden. A troll whose footfalls echoed through stone walls was a screaming red flag. The attempt on the stone required cunning, not carnage. Perhaps it was a miscalculation, born from desperation. Perhaps Quirrell, still half himself, acted without permission. Whatever the cause, it nearly brought about their ruin. To appreciate the depth of the error, consider how little Quirrell gained from it. He never reached the stone that night. He never even made it past the trapdoor. All he accomplished was broadcasting his intent to an entire castle full of alert professors and curious students. The momentary chaos brought him nothing. On the contrary, it accelerated the investigation. Meanwhile, Harry, Ron, and Hermione began to investigate the stone themselves. They questioned Hagrid. They began connecting dots. The entire arc of the Philosopher's Stone hinges on that Halloween night. Without the troll, perhaps the trio would never have become friends. Perhaps they never would have learned of Fluffy or guessed the nature of the trapdoor. Perhaps Quirrell would have succeeded. In that sense, the troll was not a distraction, it was a spotlight. It cast light into the very shadows where Quirrell hoped to hide. It turned passive students into participants, watchers into seekers, and it turned Dumbledore's quiet vigilance into an active search. The school was no longer asleep. The troll did not guard secrets, it shattered them open. The line from the book, "Harry then did something that was both very brave and very stupid," perfectly captures the ripple effect. Harry leapt forward, not just at the troll, but at the whole mystery. From that moment onward, he was no longer just a boy in a castle. He was a boy in a fight, a boy in the middle of a hidden war. And that war had been declared, perhaps unwittingly, by Quirrell himself. In the grand narrative of villains and their schemes, this one stands as an outlier, a noisy blunder dressed up as a plan. The troll in the dungeon was no stroke of genius. It was a gamble with bad odds and worse consequences. It endangered lives, exposed secrets, and ignited suspicion. And in the end, it may have done more to hasten Voldemort's downfall than to secure his return. Number 27, Regulus Black, a solo mission for the Horcrux. Of all the tragic figures in the Harry Potter saga, Regulus Arcturus Black remains one of the most haunting. Born into a house of pure-blood supremacy, showered with expectations, and inducted into the Death Eaters as a teenager, his story could have ended like so many others, another nameless pawn under Lord Voldemort's banner. But Regulus chose differently. He saw through the illusion, recognized the horror behind the Dark Lord's vision, and committed what can only be described as an act of suicidal heroism. Yet even in his defiance, his decision to act alone, with no true strategy beyond loyalty to a single house elf, became his undoing. Regulus's fate was not forged in a moment of impulse. He watched, listened, absorbed the cruelty around him. Living within the folds of number 12 Grindelwald Place, the ancestral home of House Black, he understood what power and legacy meant to Voldemort. And it is precisely this insider knowledge, gleaned from the whispers of Kreacher and the blind adoration of his own parents, that gave him access to a secret almost no one else knew. Voldemort had hidden a piece of his soul in an object, deep in a cursed cave on a blackened coast. It was not mere courage that pushed Regulus into the shadows, it was purpose. The locket Horcrux, once the proud heirloom of Salazar Slytherin, became the symbol of his rebellion. In it resided a fragment of Voldemort's soul, proof of the Dark Lord's fear of death, and the key to his unnatural immortality. Regulus didn't stumble upon this information, he pried it from careful clues, pieced together by observing Voldemort's interaction with Kreacher. The elf had been forced to accompany Voldemort to the cave to drink the inferi protected potion, and then left to die. Only Kreacher's peculiar brand of devotion allowed him to return. From that moment, something in Regulus changed, and yet what followed was a plan so breathtakingly naive that it raises more questions than answers. Armed with only Kreacher and a basic understanding of what awaited him, Regulus returned to the cave. His mission was noble, to destroy the locket, but he lacked both the means and the preparation. He brought no weapon to defeat inferi. He carried no antidote to the potion in the basin. He had no escape route. In a world where Dumbledore himself nearly perished attempting the same feat, it's hard to ignore how fatally ill-conceived Regulus's plan truly was. J.K. Rowling offered just a glimpse of his final hours through Kreacher's tearful memory. Master Regulus drank the potion, and he told Kreacher to take the locket and go home, and he ordered Kreacher to leave, without him. In that moment, the boy who once swore loyalty to Voldemort ordered a creature considered lesser by his entire family to save himself instead. It was a staggering reversal of ideology, but no one came for Regulus. No help was waiting. No one even knew what he'd attempted. His death, consumed by the darkness of the cave and likely drowned by inferi, was not just tragic. It was preventable. The problem wasn't his bravery, it was the isolation. Regulus acted entirely alone without involving his brother Sirius, who, despite their differences, might have listened. Or he might have reached out to Dumbledore, the only wizard truly equipped to handle Horcruxes. Even within the ranks of Voldemort's enemies, there were people with knowledge and power that Regulus lacked. But he never told anyone else. Why? That question hangs heavy over his story. Was it pride? Was it the Black family tendency toward secrecy? Or was it guilt, an unwillingness to admit his allegiance to Voldemort until he could erase the stain himself? Whatever the reason, the result was the same. Regulus disappeared. His family assumed he'd died in the service of the Dark Lord. Sirius dismissed him as a foolish fanatic. The Order of the Phoenix never knew his name. And the locket remained hidden for years in the dusty corner of a house no one wanted to enter. Ironically, Kreacher, the one companion Regulus trusted, became the key to his redemption decades later. It was Kreacher who eventually helped Harry, Ron, and Hermione retrieve the real locket from number 12, Grindelwald Place. But this accidental success does not absolve the recklessness of the original mission. Regulus's actions were noble but ultimately symbolic. The locket wasn't destroyed, the Horcrux remained intact. His sacrifice, while brave, accomplished nothing immediate. It was a cry into the void, a private rebellion that the world never heard. It's impossible not to compare Regulus to other figures who took on Voldemort's Horcruxes. Dumbledore spent years searching, cautiously gathering intel, and preparing countermeasures. Harry, Ron, and Hermione faced each Horcrux with teamwork, strategy, and significant magical knowledge. Even their failures, such as Ron abandoning the trio, were moments of human weakness within a larger framework of survival. Regulus, by contrast, had only conviction, and conviction without foresight is often fatal. The tragedy is amplified by timing. Had Regulus waited even a year or two, events might have changed. Had he survived long enough to witness Voldemort's downfall in 1981, he might have come forward, might have aided the Order, might have found a way to continue his mission with support. But by acting when he did, and in the way that he did, he ensured his voice would be silenced. Even the letter he left behind was vague. His initials, RAB, became a riddle for future generations to solve. He left no map, no clear guidance, only a silent legacy hidden in a cupboard. And this is where the dubious part of his decision truly emerges. Regulus wasn't wrong in his goal, but he fundamentally misunderstood what it would take to see it through. He assumed stealing the Horcrux was the end of the mission. In truth, it was only the beginning. He never accounted for how to destroy it. He never learned about basilisk venom, or the sword of Gryffindor, or fiendfire. These tools, essential to Voldemort's downfall, were utterly beyond his reach. There's also an emotional recklessness to his act that cannot be ignored. Regulus was a boy trying to atone for sins far beyond his age. Inducted into the Death Eaters as a teenager, likely too young to grasp the true horrors of that world, he became disillusioned only when the cruelty touched someone he loved. Creatures near death, Voldemort's casual disregard for even loyal servants, shattered his illusions. But reacting emotionally, even righteously, without strategic thought is not enough in war. And yet the wizarding world owes him a debt. Without his intervention, the fake locket might never have been found. Without that clue, Harry might never have realized the full extent of Voldemort's soul fragmentation. Regulus Black, the forgotten brother, became a bridge between the darkness and its destruction. His sacrifice wasn't in vain, but it was made in error. He became a martyr, not of a great campaign, but of a lonely and misguided mission. Even the place of his death reflects this tragedy. A cave designed to test endurance, to expose weakness, to ensure that anyone seeking the Horcrux would do so at a terrible cost. It demanded more than magic. It demanded planning, teamwork, and the ability to resist despair. Regulus met the challenge alone, and the cave consumed him. His body was never recovered, no grave marks his resting place. His name, cleared only by Creature's memory and Harry's understanding, exists now in whispers. Sirius never got the chance to know. In his bitterness, he dismissed Regulus as weak. He joined the Death Eaters, Sirius told Harry in Order of the Phoenix. Wasn't exactly a lovable cretin, my brother. He had no idea what Regulus had done or why. The brothers, torn by ideology and parental manipulation, never reconciled, and so the chance for alliance between them, between Sirius's rebellious fire and Regulus's quiet resolve, was lost forever. That missed opportunity defines the essence of this narrative. Regulus did not have to die. Had he trusted someone, anyone, the outcome might have been different. Creature, though loyal, was limited in knowledge and power. The moment Regulus chose him as his sole partner, he restricted the mission's scope. In a war of such magnitude, secrecy can be a death sentence. Collaboration, however difficult, might have saved him. And yet there's something profoundly moving about his failure. It speaks to the complexity of redemption. Regulus did not redeem himself in full. He didn't topple Voldemort or destroy a Horcrux, but he tried. In his final act, he reached toward the light, even as it drowned him. He challenged a god with only a house elf and a fading sense of guilt. That he failed does not negate the courage of the attempt. We often celebrate heroes for their success, but Regulus Black is a reminder that some heroes die in obscurity, their victories incomplete, their legacies uncertain. His story is not a blueprint, it is a cautionary tale. In war, even the purest intentions can falter without wisdom. Even the bravest hearts can be undone by isolation. His life was a whisper, his death a lesson. And in the end, perhaps that is enough. For without that whisper, Harry might never have found the locket. Without that silent sacrifice, the chain of events leading to Voldemort's destruction might have unravelled. Regulus Arcturus Black died alone, forgotten by his family, erased by history. But in the shadows of that cursed cave, he chose defiance, and sometimes even the most flawed decisions can shake the foundation of evil itself. Number 28. Malvolio and Morphin Gaunt, flaunting their hatred for Muggles. The old shack in Little Hangleton reeked of decay, of anger, and of time that had not passed gently. Within its crumbling walls lived the last two surviving members of the Gaunt family, Malvolio, the patriarch of ancient blood, and his twisted son, Morphin. To the wizarding world, their names were barely a whisper. To the nearby Muggle villagers, they were something far more unsettling, a lurking presence, violent and inexplicable. In the world J.K. Rowling created, villains often carry the weight of choice. Yet, in the Gaunts, what we see is something different. We see pride bred into madness and hatred fed by generations of pure-blood delusion. Their behaviour was not merely villainous, it was tragic in its recklessness. Malvolio Gaunt, descendant of Salazar Slytherin himself, believed blood purity was worth more than life. He clung to it as if it were a crown of legitimacy, even while living in squalor. He displayed Slytherin's ring with the snake-engraved coat of arms as if it were a royal seal, flaunting it not for beauty or heritage, but as a weapon of superiority. It didn't matter that the house he inhabited was barely fit for rats, or that his family tree was down to 3 broken branches. His pride burned with blind fury, fueled by hatred toward anyone he considered lesser, especially Muggles. There was no subtlety in the Gaunt's hatred. When Bob Ogden of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement arrived to question Morphin about attacking a Muggle, he encountered not suspicion, but a venomous disdain. Morphin had hexed Tom Riddle Sr., a handsome Muggle who lived nearby, simply because he had seen his sister, Merope, looking at him. There was no conversation, no explanation, only hostility. Malvolio roared at Ogden, insulted him, attacked him, all while boasting of his bloodline. "You see this?" he bellowed, displaying the ring. "I'm a pureblood, my family's as old as the hills, and if you think you can come sniffing around here with your filthy ministry nonsense—" Malvolio did not merely hate Muggles, he disdained authority, any institution that challenged his right to dominate. His entire identity was rooted in supremacy, and anything that threatened that was met with violence. This wasn't quiet bigotry, it was a loud, unhinged hostility that made it impossible for the ministry to ignore him, and indeed they didn't. Morphin was arrested for the attack, and Malvolio was dragged away soon after, both convicted and sent to Azkaban. Merope, the only Gaunt with a flicker of softness in her, was left behind, broken and alone. It's easy to see the Gaunts as caricatures of evil, howling mad, filthy and volatile. But that simplicity is deceptive. Their failure was not just moral, it was strategic. Had Malvolio been a more cunning man, he might have preserved his line. Had Morphin thought with clarity rather than impulse, he might have avoided imprisonment. Their unrelenting obsession with bloodline didn't elevate them, it destroyed them. They could have hidden their hatred, they could have cloaked their darkness beneath charm, as Voldemort later would, but they didn't. They screamed it from rooftops and were exiled from the very society they claimed to be superior to. Merope's tragic tale, the consequence of their downfall, was set in motion the moment her father and brother were taken away. Freed from their control for the first time, she seized what little power she had. She used a love potion on Tom Riddle Sr., perhaps out of desperation, perhaps out of a warped idea of romance taught to her by a life of cruelty. But the act itself was still born of the same toxic cycle. The hatred that Marvolo spewed, the violence that Morphin acted upon, led directly to the conception of the boy who would become Voldemort. It is here that the villain's decision reveals its true weight. The Gaunts could have existed on the margins. They could have nursed their bigotry quietly, evading the Ministry's eye. But their disdain was too consuming. They didn't simply believe in superiority, they demanded that the world acknowledge it, even at the cost of their survival. And in doing so, they set into motion a chain of events they could never foresee. Consider this. If Merope had been allowed a life of dignity, if she had not been oppressed by her father and tormented by her brother, she might never have bewitched Tom Riddle. She might never have borne a child, in secret, alone and unloved. And that child, Tom Marvolo Riddle, might never have grown into a man who feared death more than anything, who believed love was weakness, and who saw domination as the only path to power. Voldemort's origin lies not just in evil, but in humiliation. He was the product of a union born not of love, but of manipulation. His father abandoned his mother upon waking from the spell. His mother died giving birth to him without family or kindness. His very existence was shaped by a legacy of rage. Rowling writes in Half-Blood Prince, "It was a very shabby place with broken windows and an overgrown garden. The inside was worse, filthy, dark, and filled with the smell of something rotting." The House of the Gaunts was not merely a location, it was a reflection of their souls. It was decay passed off as nobility. Marvolo's madness wasn't poetic. It was pathetic and dangerous. He wasn't fighting for a cause, he was a relic, clutching a name that meant nothing in the modern wizarding world. The irony is sharp. The Gaunts believed themselves royal, descended from greatness, yet in their contempt they became grotesque. Their hatred consumed them from within like a curse they couldn't escape. And this is the deeper tragedy. Voldemort inherited not just their blood, but their blindness. He too would scorn muggles. He too would dismiss love. He too would rage against death, unable to see that it was his own choices that made him mortal. Had Morphin not attacked Tom Riddle Sr., the Ministry would have had no reason to visit the Gaunts. Had Marvolo treated Ogden with wary tolerance instead of violence, he might have kept his family together. Their actions weren't brave or cunning, they were reckless. A villain to succeed must mask his intentions. The Gaunts didn't. They shouted theirs, and in doing so they doomed their legacy. One cannot ignore the role of the Ministry of Magic in this collapse either. The Ministry saw the Gaunts as unstable, violent, and dangerous, and they were. But it failed to see Merope as someone worth saving. No outreach was made to protect her, even after her father and brother were jailed. The system punished the guilty but neglected the innocent. This failure allowed her to slip into desperation, to perform the unforgivable, and to die in obscurity, birthing a monster. When Dumbledore speaks of Voldemort's origins, he doesn't excuse them, but he understands them. He speaks not just of a boy born under a love spell, but of one born into a lineage of cruelty. The Gaunts didn't merely produce Voldemort biologically, they bred his ideology, their open contempt for muggles, their obsession with purity, their unchecked violence. These became Voldemort's core beliefs. It is tempting to ask, could it have been different? If Marvolo had simply taught his daughter compassion, if Morphin had been a brother instead of a tormentor, perhaps Tom Riddle would have been raised with some love, perhaps he would not have feared death so deeply, perhaps he would not have become Lord Voldemort. But speculation doesn't erase consequence. Even Voldemort himself later visited his uncle Morphin, who had by then been imprisoned again. He stole Morphin's wand, used it to murder the Riddle family, and then returned it. Morphin was later blamed and imprisoned for the murders he didn't commit. The circle completed itself. A family who began with hatred toward Muggles ended as the scapegoat for their murder. This act was not just about revenge. It was Voldemort reclaiming control over his story, turning his family's dysfunction into a symbol of dominance. But the act is also telling he didn't spare his own blood. He used it, just as they had used him. The Gaunts were not clever villains. They were loud, broken, and tragically short-sighted. Their failure lies not in their belief in blood purity, as abhorrent as it is, but in their inability to adapt, to disguise, to manipulate. Voldemort learned those lessons. He mastered deception. He wore charm like a mask. But even he could not escape the emotional vacuum from which he came. In rejecting his Muggle side, in hiding his name, in splitting his soul, he was still forever a Gaunt. Their shack may have crumbled into ruins, but its shadow stretched far. Every act of terror Voldemort committed bore its roots in that miserable house. Every Horcrux he made was a cry against mortality, a lesson he absorbed from the squalor of his youth. He became the ultimate weapon forged in a kiln of hate, cast by a family too foolish to know what they were creating. Rowling's world is filled with complex evil, men like Barty Crouch Jr., who are brilliant, women like Bellatrix, who are insane but calculating. The Gaunts stand apart. They remind us that villainy can be loud and stupid, not just cunning and quiet. And sometimes the worst monsters come not from genius but from negligence and rage. The collapse of the Gaunts was not inevitable. It was chosen, moment, by Marvolo, by Morphin, and even, in her own desperate way, by Merope. And in that choice lies the tragedy. For if even one of them had chosen differently, if even one of them had chosen peace over power, the name Voldemort might never have existed at all.